18 years following the release of the original Hitman, codenamed 47, the series lives on. Yet it was only with the release of the 2016 game that I feel Danish studio IO Interactive finally perfected the formula. Hitman has been widely recognized for its remarkably complex systemic world, engaging design, and highly replayable missions. It really is a remarkable achievement. Yet despite its success, the studio found itself in a difficult position with its former owner Square Enix, a situation which ultimately resulted in the studio going independent while joining forces with Warner Bros. For publishing. With the Hitman series firmly in its possession then, the team set out to build upon its 2016 success with a proper follow-up. Hitman 2 is a continuation of the work started in the 2016 game. 6 large environments have been crafted with a variety of new gameplay features and options now available. In building this sequel, the team leaves behind the staggered episodic release schedule in favor of releasing the full game on day 1. There's a lot of content here, and it plays just as well as you would hope, but from our perspective, the most exciting improvement stems from the changes IO made to its in-house Glacier 2 engine. IO has spent years perfecting its engine technology to support this type of game, and the new features introduced in Hitman 2 are certainly impressive. To appreciate the improvements being made then, I'd like to walk through a couple of different maps while pointing out some of the neat visual features on display. You can learn a lot about the upgraded engine just by looking carefully at the world around you, so let's begin our journey through the world of Hitman 2. The game begins here on this isolated beach. Above the players, the sky textures are warped and manipulated to simulate swirling clouds. Flashes of lightning help set the mood. It's a beautiful and suitably moody way to start the game. Glancing downward, take note of the parallax occlusion maps used for the sand textures. This is a feature that was available in the previous game as well, but it's something I always feel is worth pointing out as it's used extremely well in Hitman 2. Beyond this, the way the sand subtly blows across the environment is also a nice touch, not to mention the normal mapped footprints that 47 leaves behind. Taken as a whole, the world feels alive, with lots of animation happening around the player. And this includes these thick patches of grass scattered across the landscape. It looks beautiful with nice animation and shading, but it also works as a new gameplay element. 47 can now hide within patches of foliage, and this is something that will become more important to gameplay later on. Next, let us continue making our way towards the house on the horizon. I'm really quite fond of this setting. The contrast of this very modern looking house situated on a stormy beach is really quite appealing. It's certainly more visually striking than the training mission which begins the previous game. Now, as we approach the house, you might notice one of the limitations with distant shadow cascades exhibiting noticeable artifacts. It's one small blemish you might notice while playing the game. Of course, this also highlights a new feature for Hitman 2, Picture-in-Picture. The security camera catches sight of 47 here, and a small window showcases what the camera is seeing. This mechanic shows up throughout the game now, and not just for security cameras either. It can also show things happening in another location, giving the player more information about what's happening in the scene. As for cameras, well, you can dispatch them with a weapon, though not without some noise, a concern in later missions. Next, there is the addition of advanced lens flares. It's an effect that breathes additional vibrance into Hitman 2, bringing it closer to the stylings of something like Hitman Contracts, I feel. This beautiful effect also reflects off the windows of the second-story house, which hints at our next major feature, and this is a big one. With Hitman 2, IO Interactive has introduced full scene reflections across many of its environments. This transparent window reveals what's inside the house, but it also reflects the surrounding environment behind the player and 47 himself. It is not a static reflection, everything is still animated and it looks phenomenal. But how was it achieved? Well, our best guess here is that IO is utilizing a somewhat old school but rather expensive technique. It's a lot like what I discussed in my DF Retro episode on water covering Wave Race Blue Storm and Mario Sunshine. The basic idea is that the scene is captured using a secondary camera and the results are rendered out to a texture which is then applied to the surface. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of the basic approach I think we're seeing here. And it's interesting as reflections have become sort of a big topic with RTX from Nvidia, so you might be wondering why we don't see this sort of thing more often. Well, the solution used here is expensive to render since you're basically drawing the scene multiple times. Things are sped up slightly by reducing the resolution of the reflections, skipping out on the ambient occlusion pass and the like, but it's still a lot of extra work for the hardware, and the level of detail on display is rather high, while things like dynamic lights are still visible in the reflection. Oh, as a quick aside though, I really love the parallax occlusion maps in this specific scene. It really looks nice. Anyways, continuing. You might have also noticed that some of the smaller windows do not utilize render to texture reflections, instead relying on cube maps. But it's rarely jarring, honestly, in the grand scheme of things. So around the corner of the house then, here's another interesting spot. I just love the way this reflection looks. You can see the reflections of the blowing curtains behind the player, among other things, and it just contrasts beautifully against the large screen projected against the wall within the house. Now, moving on, how about the cloth physics here? It's nothing new per se, but I think it's a nice touch. And next to it is an example of box projected cube maps in action. You can see how the faked reflection lines up with the swimming pool behind the player, even though it's not really an accurate reflection. The water itself, though, does reflect the scenery without relying on SSR. You can see how the TV screen remains visible even though it is off screen. Now crouching down here, there's another example of parallax occlusion maps in action, along with a beautiful drain texture encircling the pool, not to mention the excellent depth blur and refraction of light visible across the bottom of the pool. Now, standing back up, if we move back outside, here's another nice detail I noticed. The passing of clouds over the low-hanging sun are simulated across the building facade. A very nice touch indeed. The corner of this house also highlights the volumetric lighting system in action. It seems that Hitman 2 uses the increasingly popular Froxel fog volume technique, and you can kind of see the shadow of the house within the volume here. Moving on, here's yet another great example of palm, a detail I simply cannot stop gushing over. Just look at the sand here, I love it. Alright though, let's move into the house itself, where plenty of additional details await. The first thing I appreciated is this LCD monitor here in the garage. There's really nothing on the screen, mind you, but the artists kindly simulated the telltale glow of a backlit monitor. Of course, if this were an OLED monitor, it would appear completely dark instead. Next up, there's this nice metallic material here which shows off the physically based rendering supported by the engine, and I really like the look of it. They are using a generic reflection map, of course, but the effect is still suitably convincing. Then, next to it, we have these objects placed neatly on the shelf. While not necessarily impressive from a technical standpoint, I find that incidental objects like this tend to feature surprisingly high resolution textures, which is something worthy of praise. Moving on then, here's another nice looking lens flare effect coupled with some excellent texture work on the wall there to the left. But in the next room, the first thing you'll encounter is this aquarium, with an associated water caustic texture applied to the surrounding area. An effect designed to simulate light from the aquarium refracting through the water. Now, into the main room. Here's another look at the reflective glass, this time from inside the home. It looks excellent just as before, but what I really like is how the video projector image is projected across multiple surfaces and parallaxed with the wall. You can see this here with how the reflection appears diffuse across the table surface, for instance. It remains animated, so it is an active animated texture, but it's not a completely comprehensive reflection solution. The same texture then is applied to the floor in this room and distorted according to the material properties, but objects like the couch are not reflected at all, suggesting once again a simplified approach compared to the glass reflections we've looked at previously. Back to the dining room table area, the carpet placed beneath the table utilizes a texture layering technique designed to create the illusion of volume. Also note the high quality materials on the chairs. It's a very fine cloth material that's really detailed. Now, in a stealth game such as Hitman, it does make some sense to test the limits of breakable objects. While most objects in the game are static, smaller details such as wine glasses and bottles can be destroyed, and the shatter effect varies based on the type of object. If you shoot a glass of red wine, for instance, red particles fly everywhere. Now, of course, none of this destruction appears to be pixel accurate, but the animation applied is still reasonably convincing. When you shoot an object, it appears to trigger a specific animation designed to give the illusion of breakage based on your shot, and it works reasonably well. Other objects in the world simply react and sway when shot, which also highlights a neat trick in this case. Notice how the same reflection trick used on the floor and table is applied to these spheres. It's the same image on all three, but it really does give the impression of genuine reflections rather than a generic static cube map. You can actually see the news broadcast image update in real time. Moving on from the living room area, Hitman 2 features some creative use of transparency in certain scenes. Check out the frosted glass here around the second floor and the stairs. Now, it doesn't properly overlap with one another, so the effect doesn't double up as you'd expect, but it's still convincing, and it does blur objects behind it. It also exhibits a pseudo-realistic crack when shot. Well, realistic if we presume it to be near bulletproof in terms of strength. Moving on to the next room, Hitman 2 also features several dynamic lights which can be disabled if shot. If I shoot this lamp, for instance, the light is extinguished and the room darkens slightly. And while we're here, check out the materials on this bed. From the velvet blanket, leather backboard, shaggy carpet, and cloth curtains, everything feels rather distinct from one another, I think. Moving into the bathroom adjacent to the bedroom, we have a full reflective mirror, which looks mostly great, I think, but it does reveal one limitation. Certain techniques, such as the frosted glass here used for the shower, do not work with the reflection. Thus, it remains invisible. Even still, mirrors are used so regularly in Hitman 2 at this point that it's hard not to be impressed with their presence. It's something that can be used during actual gameplay to see what's happening outside of your field of view. That wraps up most of this house, I think, but before we leave, I do want to highlight one more example of glass reflection. Each of these two large windows show reflections, allowing players to see Agent 47 and the surrounding room from multiple perspectives. This is certainly something we do not often see in games. Speaking of Agent 47, I feel that this scene does a nice job highlighting the variation in material used in his starting outfit. The jeans, cloth, and plastic material all appear distinct from one another. Okay though, this first mission, it's beautiful and atmospheric, but it's also rather limited in terms of size and scope, so to better appreciate the rest of the package, let's jump to the next mission in Miami, Florida. This mission features a completely different scenario, a crowded racetrack set during midday, and the crowd is a real highlight in this scene. More detailed than ever, the crowd is packed with plenty of detailed models filling out the ranks. It's even possible for members of the crowd to interact with one another now. Notice how this couple have their arms around one another. Now, if we walk through this main entry point, 47 must undergo a quick frisking, which also triggers the depth of field effect with nice bokeh shapes. This effect varies in terms of size based on the resolution, however, but console comparisons will have to wait until the next video. So from here we enter the most crowded area of the facility, with a large visible crowd sprawled out before the player. As with the grass in the first mission, players can now hide within the crowds, concealing themselves from pursuers, making them more useful than in previous games. There's a huge variety of texture and model detail in this scene that looks especially nice when running at higher resolutions like this. Now though, let's move up the stairs to the main stand. When we first emerge, check out the beautiful waving flags which make use of the same cloth technique used for the curtains in the first mission. Where this area really excels, however, is in its lighting. Notice how light penetrates the cloth material above the stands, projecting a soft red glow upon the scene, while light bounces off the green floor, resulting in a greenish hue bouncing up onto objects. This is a technique featured throughout many of the environments in the game, and the idea here is to simulate bounce lighting. Now, of course, there are no real-time time of day changes in here, but the effect is impressive nonetheless. In addition, while we're here, this scene also showcases one of the optimizations made with the crowd system. Dynamic shadows are only drawn within a certain proximity to the player. Observe here as they fade in and out in this scene. This is not the case for world shadows, I should note, but you'll definitely notice on large crowds such as this. Still, the overall effect is convincing. Packed stands, lots of individual animations, stable performance, and great image quality. It's a beautiful scene all around. And it's really just one tiny area of this overall map. This is a huge area with so many different buildings and structures to enter. Every room you could imagine is completely accessible by the player, and there's so many gadgets and tools and things to fiddle around with. It really is a great Hitman map. Between the sunny areas outdoors and the racing area where the pit crews are working on the cars, or this building here with this sort of moody museum area that I really like. And of course, later in the stage, there's this indoor section with these beautiful reflections. Again, the entire world is reflected in the floor with a nice surface shader effect applied to its surface, enhancing the overall technique. It looks really great. Of course, this stage also presents a few actual mirrors as well, which highlights another limitation. As we saw with the frosted shower stall in the first mission, 47's sunglasses lose their tone in the mirror. It looks a little strange, I think. Still, overall, I feel that these two missions that we've looked at thus far do an excellent job of showcasing the current state of Hitman, and Glacier 2, but it's just the beginning. Some of the other stages in Hitman 2 offer a lot of dense foliage, for instance, with this thick volumetric fog effect and a more muted color palette. It looks great, and it's a little different from the other areas we've seen thus far. While others delve into spots like this, the city streets of Mumbai, presenting a beautiful look at the city at dusk. It's a great environment to explore and packed with detail. And there's more, of course, and each of them is highly detailed and quite different from a previous map, and that's one of the strengths of the Hitman series. Every location that you visit is highly bespoke. They're crafted with a specific goal in mind, and there's just a lot of detail and effort poured into each one. It's something I really like about the game. Now, outside of the missions themselves, the interface itself is also worth mentioning. All UI elements are rendered at a native 4K on the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, while original machines naturally reduce this to 1080p, but the point is that the design is super sharp and clean throughout. Menu navigation looks and feels very polished this time around. Hitman 2 has also become a hub of sorts for all things related to the current iteration of the game, or the world of assassination, if you will. If you own the previous Hitman, older missions become available to play, complete with enhanced visuals, and it's all selectable from one main menu system. So really, thus far, I think it's fair to say that Hitman 2 looks great, but I do have a few nitpicks that I wanted to raise. The first becomes evident when running the game at a higher frame rate. We'll have performance numbers in the next video, of course, but all four versions include capped and uncapped frame rate options, which highlights this issue. Basically, some objects, such as these trees in this particular scene, animate at half rate, something that can also apply to distant members of the crowd in certain instances and other things. Beyond that, when zooming in and out with the left trigger, the camera zoom effect updates at half rate as well, which again, looks rather strange when targeting 60 FPS. I'd also like to see the addition of per object motion blur in the future as an option for Glacier 2, as I feel it's one of the key visual features that the series is lacking. Oh, and as I do in every Hitman video, I must continue to lament the absence of a Jesper Kid score. The new soundtrack created for Hitman 2, it's not bad, but I still think it lacks that memorable atmosphere that Kid's music brought to the table. Perhaps someday they'll reunite, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. Still, overall, Hitman 2 is an impressive effort all around. The worlds crafted for the sequel are beautiful to explore and packed with detail. The new lighting system offers improved fidelity across each map with a more realistic approach to global illumination that allows material properties to influence the mood of each scene. The star of the show, however, remains the aforementioned reflections. It's so rare to see a game focus so heavily on a visual feature like this when it's so expensive to use, but it's clear that the results are worth it. The big question for me is whether or not the PC version will support RTX functionality and offer ray traced reflections instead, though it seems a little unlikely at this point. I suppose, though, the real question for anyone watching then is, how does Hitman 2 stack up across different platforms? Well, dear viewers, that video will be finished up and go live in the next day or so, but the initial results are certainly promising. I opted to focus on the Xbox One X version for this video due to support for higher resolutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best version of the bunch. Tune in and find out what I'm talking about when it goes live. But that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell to receive updates for the channel, and of course follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, enjoy the world of assassination.